The Silent Dreams.
Welcome back. Wherever you are tonight, whatever the day has left behind in your body, in your thoughts, in the small accumulated weight of ordinary hours, I want you to set it down now. Not permanently, not forever, just for this. Just for the next hour or however long it takes for sleep to find you. You can pick it all up again tomorrow if you need to. Tonight you are allowed to be without it. Let your body be still. Let your breathing slow to its own pace, not the pace you think it should have, not the pace that deliberate calm requires, but the pace your body finds on its own when nothing is asked of it. The slow, slightly uneven breathing of a body that is releasing the day rather than managing it. Uneven is fine. Slow is enough. Whatever your body does when left to itself is correct. Notice the surface beneath you. Its weight and its warmth and the way it holds you without effort, without condition, without asking anything in return for the support it offers. You are held. You have always been held. Tonight that is enough to know. Take one slow breath in and release it. Tonight I am taking you outside, into the gardens of Topkapi Palace in the city of Istanbul on an autumn night in the year 1544. The palace is sleeping. The courtyards are empty. The guards have made their last circuit and retreated to their posts. And in the third courtyard, between the old plane trees and the sleeping rose beds, and the fountain that runs all night regardless of whether anyone is listening, an old man is walking. His name is Kasim. He is the head gardener of the palace, and he has been so for more years than most people in this palace have been alive. He knows every tree in these grounds. He knows the smell of this particular soil after rain, the way it changes in the days following a heavy autumn shower, the earth opening slightly and releasing the smell of everything it contains, the roots, the decaying matter, the organisms too small to see that make the soil what it is, and without which no garden could exist. He knows the sound this particular fountain makes in autumn, when the water is colder and the pipe through which it enters the basin has contracted fractionally, and the pressure changes, and the note drops by an interval he cannot name but can hear clearly. He knows the garden in every season and every hour, and tonight he is walking it one final time. Let yourself soften now. Let the palace walls rise around you, old stone, cold in the autumn night, holding the warmth of the afternoon sun only at the very surface. Let the plane trees spread their dark canopy above. Let the night air cool against whatever is still warm from the day. Walk with Kasim. Listen. In the hour before the first call to prayer, when the palace held its breath, and the fires in the kitchens had been banked, and the corridors of the inner courts lay in uninterrupted dark, the garden of the third courtyard was alive. Not loudly, not in any way that would be described as active by someone who had not spent decades learning to distinguish the garden's quiet from ordinary silence, but alive in the way that gardens are alive at night, differently than by day, more internally, the visible life replaced by other forms of life that proceeded in the dark without needing to be seen, the roots extending their slow work in the soil, the leaves conducting their exchanges with the night air, taking in what they needed and releasing what they did not, the insects moving through the garden on their own errands, the worms in the earth doing the slow work that made the earth what it was, all of this happening in the dark, below the level of visibility, in the layer of life that a garden contained beneath the layer that showed itself to human eyes. Kasim had learned to be aware of this invisible life. It had taken years. The first years of his service here, he had come as a young man, barely 17, the son of a gardener from Edirne whose connection to a palace official had secured the posting. The first years he had perceived the garden primarily as the sum of its visible parts. The plants he could see, the growth he could measure, the conditions he could observe. The invisible layer had been present, of course, as it always was, but he had not been attending to it, had not yet developed the long intimacy with this specific piece of ground that would eventually make the invisible layer as available to him as the visible one. That intimacy had come slowly, over many years, through the accumulation of observation so patient and so continuous that it had eventually crossed from observation into something more like knowledge. Not the knowledge of a scientist who has measured and recorded, but the knowledge of a person who has simply been present in a place long enough that the place has become transparent to them. Its workings visible not because they have been sought, but because nothing about the place has been hidden from long enough attention. He moved now along the central path, his lantern held low. He was old, 70 years, or close to it, the precise number having become less important to him as the years passed, age becoming less a measure of elapsed time than a quality of the present moment, something he was rather than something he had accumulated. He was old in his joints, and in the way his body moved slower than it had been, more deliberate, each step placed with a care that had once been unnecessary and was now simply part of how he walked. But he was not old in his attention. His attention was as sharp as it had been at 30, perhaps sharper, the decades having refined it the way a stone is refined by a river, worn down in some respects, polished in others, the inessential removed and the essential clarified. He moved slowly along the central path and attended to everything. The plane trees were the oldest living things in the palace. Older than the current buildings, older than the dynasty that had commissioned them, possibly older than the Ottoman presence in this city at all. There were 4 of them in the third courtyard, arranged at intervals along the central path, with a spacing that Kasim had long believed was intentional. That someone, centuries before him, had planted these trees with an understanding of what they would become, had allowed for the enormous space each one would eventually require, and had positioned them accordingly, planning not for the trees they were planting, but for the trees those trees would become in 100 years, in 200 years. He did not know if this was true. There were no records of the original planting that he had ever been able to find, but the spacing seemed too generous, too precisely calculated for the current size of the trees, to have been anything but deliberate, the work of someone who thought in the timescale of trees rather than the timescale of human plans. Kasim stopped beneath the first of them. He set his lantern on the stone path and looked up. The canopy spread above him in the dark, the leaves still mostly present in early autumn, their edges just beginning to yellow at the tips. The first visible sign of the change that would accelerate over the coming weeks, the leaves turning and loosening, and eventually falling in the manner of plain tree leaves, which did not drop individually but came down in batches, groups of leaves releasing together as though by agreement. As though the tree had decided that a section of its canopy had completed its season's work and was ready to be let go. He had watched this process 43 times. He still found it interesting to watch, the tree's own decision-making about its own leaves, the criteria by which it determined when any given leaf had done enough, criteria that he could infer from the results but could not directly observe. He placed his hand on the trunk. The bark was slightly rough under his palm and slightly cool, the outer surface having given up most of its stored warmth to the autumn night, the deep interior of the tree still warm but the surface cold. He could feel the scale of the tree through his palm, the mass of it, the presence of something enormous and very old, a weight of living material that went far above him and far below him, the canopy extending into the dark and the root system extending into the earth, each as large in its own direction as the other, the tree balanced between its 2 environments. He had placed his hand on this trunk perhaps 10,000 times. The number seemed impossibly large when he tried to count it, and entirely believable when he simply accepted it. 43 years of daily contact with these trees. The contact so ordinary that most individual instances had not been retained as memories, had dissolved into the continuous experience of tending this garden rather than existing as separate moments. But the continuous experience was real. Its weight was real. He felt it now in his hand on the bark, the 43 years of contact present in the ease of the gesture, the way his hand went to the tree as naturally as it went to his own face. He liked what the plain trees did to the palace. He had always liked this, the way the great trees made the palace feel temporary. Not precarious, not insufficient, but temporary in the honest sense, in the sense that all human constructions were temporary when placed next to things that grew by the logic of centuries rather than the logic of human plans. The buildings of the palace had been built by specific people at specific times for specific purposes, and they could be altered or added to or demolished. And several sections of the palace complex had been altered or added to or demolished and rebuilt in the course of Kasim's tenure, the institution constantly adjusting itself to new needs and new resources and new aesthetic preferences. But the plain trees had simply grown. They had grown through every change, absorbing each change into their annual rings without comment, continuing their own unhurried business of getting larger and older and more present regardless of what the humans around them were deciding or building or tearing down. They would outlast the current buildings. They would probably outlast the dynasty. This did not trouble Kasim. It comforted him, in the way that long perspectives comforted, by reducing the apparent importance of things that seemed important at close range. He picked up his lantern. He moved on to the second tree, and the third, placing his hand on each in turn, a ritual that had developed gradually over the years, and that he had never consciously decided to adopt, but that had simply become part of his practice, the trees requiring this acknowledgement or seeming to. The gardener's hand on the bark being his way of saying, I am still here, I am still attending, the season is turning, and I am here for it as I have been for all the others. The fountain stood at the center of the garden's southern half. A marble basin fed by a pipe that entered through the eastern wall and discharged into the basin with a sound that was the garden's continuous voice, the sound that was present at every hour of the day and night, and that Kasim had stopped consciously registering years ago, the way one stopped registering the sound of one's own breathing. The fountain was simply part of what the garden was. Its absence, on the rare occasions when the water supply was interrupted for maintenance, was felt as a quality of wrongness before it was identified as any specific missing thing, the garden seeming incomplete in a way that took a moment to diagnose. When the water returned, Kasim always stood for a moment beside the fountain and listened, confirming the resumption, the fountain's voice telling him that the garden was whole again. He stopped beside it now. The note was lower than it had been in July. He had noticed this change every autumn for as long as he had been listening, the water cooling in the autumn months, its behavior in the pipe, and at the outlet changing fractionally, the note of the discharge dropping by an interval that he could not precisely measure but that he could hear clearly, the way a musician hears a change in pitch without necessarily being able to name the interval. He had tried to explain this to his successor once, during one of the training walks they had taken together in recent months, and had seen the young man listening politely without quite hearing what he was describing. The autumn note required years of listening to the summer note before it became distinguishable. It was not something that could be described and then heard. It had to be heard first and described afterward, the description always arriving too late to be useful as preparation. This was true of many things about the garden, and it was why he had spent 3 years trying to transmit his knowledge to his successor, rather than the 3 weeks that would have been sufficient for any instruction that could be put into words. He cupped his hand in the basin. The water was cold, very cold by now, the autumn rains having added their cold to the supply that came down through the aqueducts from the hills north of the city. He held his hand in the water for a moment, feeling the cold move up through his palm and wrist, feeling the slight ache it produced in the knuckle of the index finger on his right hand, the knuckle that had been troubling him for 2 years with the persistent mild pain that he associated with age and with the particular demands of 43 years of garden work. The digging and lifting and pruning and carrying that had made him strong in his youth, and that had left their evidence in his joints now that the strength had moderated. He did not mind the ache. It was information about his history, as much as anything. The garden had left its mark on him, as he had left his mark on the garden, the relationship between the person and the place being one of mutual influence over long enough time. The ache in his knuckle was the garden's contribution to his body, as surely as the beds he had planted and the trees he had pruned were his contribution to the garden. He withdrew his hand and dried it on his coat. He stood for a moment listening to the fountain's autumn note, trying to hold it precisely in his mind, to fix it in the kind of memory that preserved qualities rather than just facts. He was not certain this was possible. Memory for qualities was less reliable than memory for facts, more subject to interference and distortion, more likely to average out the specific details of any given instance into a general impression that was accurate in type, but not in particular. He would remember that the autumn note was lower than the summer note. He was not certain he would be able to remember exactly how much lower, exactly what quality of lower, the fullness of the sound, the specific timbre, the way the lower frequency resonated slightly differently in the basin's marble. He would remember the memory of the sound rather than the sound itself. But the memory of the sound was what he had available to him, and it was something, and he held it as carefully as he could. The rose garden occupied the northern quarter of the third courtyard. Separated from the main garden by a low hedge of box that Kasim had planted himself 30 years ago, when it had been barely ankle height, and he had not been entirely certain it would establish itself in the soil on that side of the courtyard, which was drier than the soil elsewhere and more exposed to the eastern wind. It had established itself. Slowly, with the setbacks that box always suffered in its first years. The winter kill, the occasional disease, the competition from weeds that had to be removed by hand rather than by hoe, because the box was too young and too small to survive the disturbance that a hoe would have caused. But it had survived all of this and had grown, incrementally, year by year, into the dense, even structure that it now was. He trimmed it every spring with a line stretched between wooden stakes, ensuring the leveled top that he required, and that no assistant had ever managed to produce to his satisfaction without his direct supervision. His successor would trim it differently, would bring his own standard to it, would decide for himself what level meant and what evenness meant, would make it his. Kasim found, examining his feelings on this, that he was not troubled by it. The box would be fine. He passed through the gap in the hedge and entered the rose garden. In autumn the roses were past their second flowering, the blooms finished, the hips beginning to show on the older plants, small hard fruits, dark red against the bare wood of the older canes, the thing the rose was actually trying to produce before the gardener intervened and redirected the plant's energy toward a second round of blooms. Kasim had always felt a slight guilt about the deadheading, the removal of the spent blooms that prevented the rose from setting fruit, and that tricked the plant into another flowering, a manipulation of the plant's intentions for the gardener's own purposes. He had done it anyway, because the palace wanted roses in autumn, and his job was to produce what the palace wanted, but he had never been entirely comfortable with the deception. Now, in the evenings of his career, he had reduced the deadheading of the older plants, allowing them to set their hips, giving them back at the end what he had been taking from them for decades. A small restitution. He did not know if plants experienced restitution, but it seemed right. He moved slowly between the beds. The names of the roses were in his head as he passed them, not the formal names, most of which he had never known or had long since forgotten, but his own names for them, the names he had given them in his private taxonomy over 43 years of growing them. The Damascus rose, which he called by its origin because it had come to the palace as a gift from a Syrian merchant, and because Damascus seemed to be the right name for its specific deep red, the red of a city that had been producing this color for longer than any records indicated. The pale pink variety that he called the widow's rose, not because anyone had told him that was its name, but because a colleague who had died 20 years ago had tended it for the years before his death with a particular devotion that Kasim had found moving, and that he had commemorated in the only way available to him. In the name he used for the rose in his own head. The deep red variety that he called simply the first rose, because he had planted it in the first year of his appointment as head gardener, as a young man of 27 wanting to mark the occasion with something permanent. These names existed nowhere but in his memory and would disappear with him unless he told someone, and he had not told anyone, the names being private in a way that resisted transmission, belonging to his relationship with the garden rather than to any knowledge about the garden that could be handed on. He stopped beside the first rose. It had been a cane when he planted it, a young plant, purchased from a grower in the city, its potential visible but its character not yet expressed. Now it was old enough to have a trunk, the basal canes having thickened over decades into something woody and substantial, the bark of the oldest canes rough and dark, more like the bark of a small tree than the smooth green wood of the plant's early years. He had pruned it every winter and fed it every spring and watched it through every summer, had nursed it through the difficult years when disease had struck the rose beds and had treated it when it was affected and had mourned briefly when one or two of the original plants in the bed had not survived. The first rose had survived everything. It was here. He was here. Both of them had made it this far. He did not find this sentimental. Or rather, he found it sentimental in the way that honest feeling was sometimes sentimental, not as an excess or a distortion of appropriate response, but simply as an accurate report on what it felt like to have been in relationship with a living thing for a very long time. The rose was not aware of him. He was aware of the rose. The relationship was asymmetrical in that way, as the relationship between a gardener and a garden always was, the gardener attending to the garden across the full span of their life in the garden simply growing, responding to conditions, doing what gardens do without knowing that it was being cared for. But the care had been real. The relationship had been real. The fact that it was not reciprocal did not make it less so. He was not troubled by leaving this rose. He had thought about this before tonight, had examined his feelings about the retirement with the same methodical attention he brought to the examination of his plants, looking for distress, for signs of the grief or loss that leaving a long attachment might reasonably produce. He had found some. He would miss the garden. He had known this for some time and accepted it without drama as a simple consequence of having spent 43 years in a place. But beneath the expected loss there was something else, a quality that he could only describe as satisfaction, the specific satisfaction of having done a thing for long enough that the doing had become the thing, that the gardener and the garden had spent enough time together to produce between them something that neither could have produced alone. This garden was partly what it was because of him, and he was partly what he was because of this garden, and the exchange between them was complete, or complete enough for one lifetime. More than one lifetime was not available to him. This one would do. He made his way to the eastern wall. The oldest wall in the third courtyard, its stone a different color from the surrounding construction, darker and more weathered, its surface carrying the particular roughness of stone that has been exposed to many winters. He had always felt an affinity for this wall that went beyond its practical relationship to the garden, not merely the wall against which the fig tree grew and the climbing rose had been trained in better years, but the wall as itself, as an object of age and endurance that asked nothing except to be left standing. Other sections of the palace had been rebuilt or altered in his time here. This wall had not. It had stood through every renovation and reconstruction, absorbing the changes around it, incorporated into new designs without being altered itself, its age having become its argument for preservation. The palace had decided, at some point before Kasim's tenure, that this wall was worth keeping as it was, that its age was itself a value, that something in its particular weathered stone should not be smoothed or replaced or faced with newer material. He agreed with this decision. He had always agreed with decisions that valued age as age, rather than trying to correct it into something younger, and more uniform. The fig tree grew against the lower half of the wall. He had not planted it. It had been here when he arrived, already established, its roots having found some crack in the wall's foundation and used it for years before his arrival. He had considered removing it in his first years as head gardener, when the impulse toward formal order had been strongest in him, when the pleasure of imposing a coherent plan on the garden had not yet been moderated by long experience of the ways that gardens resisted plans and developed better ones of their own. He had not removed it. Something had always stopped him, some recognition of the tree's established claim on its corner, its prior presence, its right to occupy a space it had found for itself rather than been assigned to. Over the years, the recognition had deepened into appreciation, the fig becoming one of his favorite things in the garden precisely because it had not been planned, because it demonstrated the garden's capacity to exceed any particular gardener's intentions, to produce things that the gardener had not imagined and would not have imagined. The best gardens were always partly the gardener's design and partly the garden's own idea. This fig tree was the garden's idea, and it was a good one. The fig had lost most of its leaves. It was one of the first trees to defoliate each autumn, the large palmate leaves dropping quickly once the cold arrived, leaving the gray-white branches bare and sculptural, the winter form of the tree as interesting to Kasim as the summer form, each season of the fig revealing a different character. A few leaves remained on the outer branches, yellowed and curled at the edges, holding on with the persistence that he had observed in plants many times. The last few leaves of a season always holding longest, as though the tree was reluctant to complete the transition, as though there were something in the last leaves that the tree wanted to keep a little longer. He had never been able to determine whether this appearance of reluctance corresponded to any actual process in the tree's biology or whether it was simply the statistical inevitability that some leaves would fall last, and that the last falling leaves would always look, to human eyes, like reluctance. He had decided some years ago that the question was not resolvable with the tools available to him, and had made his peace with not knowing. He stood beneath the fig tree and looked at the old wall behind it. The wall in the lantern's light was all texture, the individual stones distinguishable, each one slightly different from its neighbors, the mortar between them darker and in some places absent, the stones in contact in those places, relying on their own weight and fit to hold their position. He had pointed some of the mortar joints himself, years ago, when the decay had become pronounced enough to be concerning, had spent a week of autumn mornings on a ladder with a trowel, working the new mortar into the joints with the precision that old stone required, matching the texture of the surrounding material as closely as possible. The repaired sections were visible to him because he knew where they were. But he had done a good enough job that they would not be visible to anyone who did not already know. This, too, was a form of care that would outlast him, visible in the wall's continued standing rather than in any obvious mark, the evidence of his presence preserved not in a signature, but in the integrity of the structure. He turned from the eastern wall and began the final path. The western path, which ran along the inner face of the palace building on that side of the courtyard, narrower than the central path, shaded by day, the passage of light through it different from anywhere else in the garden, because the building wall to the east blocked the morning sun, and the plane trees to the west blocked the afternoon light, leaving this path in a particular quality of dimness even at midday, a dimness that deepened at night into the most complete darkness in the courtyard. The lantern here more necessary than anywhere else. This was the path where he had always gone to think. Not to observe, as he did on the central path, and not to inspect, as he did when moving through the rose beds, but to think, in the particular mode that required movement but not attention to destination, that benefited from the slight regularity of an enclosed path whose length was known and whose turning point was familiar. He had walked this path back and forth in the early mornings of difficult seasons, working through problems that the garden presented and that had no obvious solution: the disease that had taken 3 rose beds in his 20th year of service, the drought summer of his 35th year that had required decisions about which plants to sacrifice and which to save. He had walked it back and forth in the evenings too, at the end of difficult days, letting the path's familiar length absorb the difficulty without requiring him to solve anything, the walking itself being the response rather than a preparation for a response. He would miss this path. He would miss the specific quality of thinking it produced, which was not a quality available to him in any other place he knew. He walked slowly. The lantern made its small moving circle of light on the path ahead, illuminating the pale stone, the low border of lavender on either side. Dormant now, the gray-green stems without flower, the whole border waiting for spring with the patient certainty of a plant that has survived many winters and has no reason to doubt that it will survive this one. Beyond the lavender, the darkness of the building wall on his right and the darkness of the open garden to his left, the outline of the nearest plane tree just visible at the edge of the lantern's reach. He walked the length of the path and stood at its northern end, looking south along its length toward the gate that connected this courtyard to the inner palace beyond. He thought about his successor. The young man, 32 years old, patient and observant, already developing the gardener's particular quality of attention that distinguishes the good gardener from the merely competent one. Kasim had been watching him for 3 years, not with the critical eye of a superior assessing a subordinate, but with the eye of someone looking for the signs of genuine vocation. The curiosity about individual plants that went beyond what the job required, the willingness to stay in the garden past the end of the working day simply because the light was doing something interesting or a plant was at a moment in its development worth watching. He had seen these signs. He had seen them with satisfaction, the satisfaction of a person who has held something important for a long time and has found someone worth entrusting it to. The garden would be well tended. He was certain of this in the way that he was certain of things that had taken long observation to confirm, not the quick certainty of initial impression, which he had learned to distrust in the garden as elsewhere, but the settled certainty that came from watching something or someone over time, from seeing how they responded to difficulty and to the unexpected, from having occasion to observe not just the easy cases but the hard ones. His successor had handled 3 hard cases in the past year: the late frost that had damaged the new plantings, the irrigation problem that had required improvised solutions while the regular system was repaired, the political situation that had required the garden to be transformed for an important ceremony in a matter of days. He had handled all 3 correctly, without panic, with the inventive calm that difficult situations required. He would handle whatever came after Kasim the same way. This was all Kasim needed to know. And he knew it. He reached the northwestern corner of the courtyard and stood for a moment before turning back. From here, on a clear night, if he turned and looked south, he could see the full length of the central path, the plane trees standing at their intervals, the fountain at the far end just visible, the lanterns of the inner gate beyond it. The garden laid out before him like a plan, like the plan he had held in his head for 43 years, and that the garden had been, for those 43 years, the physical expression of, or rather, had been in constant dialogue with. The plan and the garden always slightly different from each other, the plan adjusting to accommodate what the garden actually did, and the garden being guided by the plan back toward what it was supposed to be, the two of them in permanent negotiation. He looked at it. The central path with its stone, paler than the surrounding ground. The plane trees at their intervals, their canopies dark against the slightly lighter dark of the autumn sky. The rose beds invisible in the darkness beyond the box hedge but present to him anyway, the familiarity of the garden making the invisible parts as available as the visible ones. The eastern wall with its fig tree, the figs bare arms against the stone. The fountain, audible from here, its autumn note the lowest note in the garden's composition. The lavender borders along the western path, dormant and gray and waiting. 43 years. He did not try to sum them up. Some things resisted summation, and this was one of them. The experience of 43 years in a place was not the kind of experience that yielded to the attempt to condense it into something smaller than itself. It was simply what it was, 43 years, each one different from the others, each one containing its own seasons and its own difficulties and its own small satisfactions, the whole thing adding up to a life that had been, in the most important sense, a life in a garden, a life shaped by the concerns and the rhythms and the specific character of this particular piece of ground. He had not planned to spend his life this way. He was glad on this final night that he had. Gladness was the right word. He had thought about whether there was a more precise word and had not found one. Gladness would do. He turned and walked back along the western path, toward the central path and the fountain and the last of the night. The call to prayer began as he was crossing the center of the garden. He had heard this call in this garden for 43 years, had heard it in every season and every weather, in rain and in the deep cold of January nights, and in the soft warmth of May evenings, in the early morning dark, and in the last of the afternoon light. He knew its particular quality in this garden, the way the stone walls and the trees filtered and shaped the sound as it came over the palace from the mosques below. The call arriving at the garden with a specific character that was different from the call heard from the open air of the outer courts or from the enclosed spaces of the corridors. The garden's call to prayer had a particular quality of arrival, of a sound that had traveled to reach this place, that had passed through distance and stone, and the canopy of the plane trees to arrive here, changed by its journey, carrying the character of the spaces it had moved through. He stopped walking. He listened to the call complete itself. Each phrase, each drawn note, each pause between the phrases, he attended to all of it, not with the analytical attention of someone trying to understand the call, but with the simple receptive attention of someone who had been listening to this call for 43 years, and for whom listening to it was itself a form of presence, a way of being in the garden and in the city, and in the night that required nothing except that he stop and hear. The call faded. The silence that followed was the richest silence of the night, the silence that had absorbed the call and been changed by it, made fuller by what had passed through it. He had always felt this in the garden. The silence after the call to prayer was different from the silence that preceded it, was somehow more complete, as though the call had tested the silence's depth and found it sufficient and confirmed it. He did not know if this was a quality of the silence itself or a quality of his perception of the silence, and he had long since decided that the distinction did not matter, that what he experienced was what he experienced, and that the experience was real. He walked to the fountain and stood beside it. The last time. He did not make a formal thing of it, did not perform a ceremony of leave-taking, did not say anything. He simply stood beside the fountain and listened to the autumn note and felt the night air against his face and smelled the garden's autumn smell, the leaves returning to soil, the soil cooling, the specific scent of the fountain's water mixed with the mineral smell of the wet stone of the basin and the general cold damp of the October night. He committed none of it to deliberate memory. It was already in him. It had been in him for 43 years, laid down in the way that long experience laid things down, not in the explicit accessible storage of deliberate memory, but in something deeper, something less retrievable but more permanent, the knowledge that a body accumulates through long presence in a place, and that becomes, eventually, indistinguishable from the body itself. He extinguished the lantern. He had done this intentionally, on this final night, wanting to be in the garden in the dark that the garden had before he arrived, the darkness without human light, the darkness that was the garden's own condition before anyone thought to carry a lantern into it. The darkness came completely, and then, as his eyes adjusted incompletely, the garden emerging from the dark by degrees, the plane trees first, their shapes large enough to register against the slightly lighter sky, then the fountain, its pale marble just visible, then the path, the stone lighter than the surrounding ground, then the outlines of the rose beds, the box hedge a low dark line. He could see it. He could see the garden he had tended for 43 years in the dark, by the light that the sky gave without assistance. This seemed right. This seemed the appropriate last sight of it, not the lantern's golden circle, which was his addition, but the garden as it was in itself, in the light it actually had, which was enough. It had always been enough. And Kasim, who had tended this garden for 43 years, and had asked of it only that it grow, stood in the dark between the old plane trees, and listened to the fountain run its autumn note into the still air, and felt the cold of the October night against his face, and smelled the garden's own smell, the smell that had been here before him and would be here after him, and was, in the most complete and unqualified sense of the word, content. Sleep now. The garden is breathing. The plane trees stand in the dark, patient as they have always been, their roots going down as deep as their branches go up, the balance between above and below maintained without effort, the way balance is maintained when a thing has been growing long enough to find its own equilibrium. The fountain runs its low autumn note into the quiet, the water falling into the basin receiving the water, the sound of the one meeting the other, the same sound it has always been, the same sound it will be tomorrow and in the spring and in the summers to come. You are held here between the old trees, beneath the clouded stars, in the deep hour that belongs to the garden and to no one else. Let your body be heavy. Let your breath find its own slow pace, the pace of soil releasing warmth into the autumn night, gradual, continuous, giving back what it has held through the long day without urgency and without stopping. The garden does not require anything of you tonight. It simply grows, it simply breathes, as you do, as you have always done whether or not you were attending to it. The roses are sleeping, the lavender is waiting, the fig tree holds its bare arms against the old stone wall, the plane trees stand. Sleep. He had begun the formal transmission 3 years ago. Not because he had known then that 3 years would be the remaining span of his service. He had not known that, had not in fact made any decision about when he would retire until less than a year ago, when the subject had been raised by the palace administration in the respectful, but direct way that such subjects were eventually raised with people of his age, in positions of his responsibility. He had begun the transmission because his successor had arrived in the garden, and because the knowledge he carried needed to be given to someone, and because the giving of knowledge required time in a way that no other aspect of gardening did, more time than the planting of a tree, more time than the establishment of a rose bed, more time than any physical task that the garden demanded. Knowledge moved slowly between people. This was one of the things he had learned in his years of receiving it from the gardener before him, and now in his years of trying to pass it on. It moved slowly because most of it was not the kind of knowledge that could be stated, was not a set of facts or rules or instructions that could be written down and read and understood. It was the kind of knowledge that lived in the body rather than in the mind, that had to be acquired through presence and practice, and the slow accumulation of direct experience rather than through instruction. He could tell his successor that the autumn note of the fountain was lower than the summer note, and his successor could hear this statement and understand it intellectually and even confirm it by listening to the fountain in autumn and finding it lower than he remembered from summer. But the knowledge of how much lower, of what the lower note told you about the water temperature and the pipe contraction and the subtle changes in the garden's condition that accompanied this change in the fountain, this knowledge was not transmissible by statement. It required years of listening to both notes and the many notes between them before the relationship became legible. His successor had 3 years of that listening. He had 7 or 8 still to develop before the fountain would tell him everything it had told Kasim. This was acceptable. The knowledge would develop as knowledge always developed in the garden, through time, through presence, through the irreplaceable experience of being here, season after season, attending. Kasim could not give his successor 43 years of listening. He could give him 3 years of deliberate teaching, and the teaching would establish the frame within which the listening would occur, would make the listening more directed and more productive than it would have been without the teaching. This was all any teacher could do, and it was enough. The rest was time. He thought about his own teacher, the gardener he had served under for his first 12 years at the palace. A man of formidable patience and equally formidable exacting standards. A man who had accepted nothing that was merely adequate when something better was possible, and who had made his apprentices feel, through this refusal, that they were capable of something better, that adequate was a temporary condition rather than a permanent destination. Kasim had sometimes found this exhausting and had occasionally found it infuriating, but he had never stopped finding it instructive, and he had carried the habit of refusal into his own practice. The refusal to accept a pruning cut that was only approximately correct when a more precisely placed cut was possible. The refusal to accept a planting plan that was merely adequate when a better arrangement would serve the garden's needs more fully. His teacher had been dead for 20 years. He was in the garden still, in the habits of attention that Kasim had learned from him, and that would persist in the garden through Kasim's successor if the transmission had been successful. He had reason to think it had. He also thought about the things that had not transmitted. The knowledge he carried that he had not managed to give to his successor, either because the occasions had not arisen, or because the knowledge was too specific to his own relationship with this garden to be generalized into teaching. The specific weight of the soil in the rose beds at different times of year, which told him things about its moisture content, and its structure that he could not quantify but could feel through the handle of a fork. The specific quality of light in the third courtyard on certain afternoons in late spring, when the angle of the sun and the height of the plane tree canopy combined to produce a quality of illumination that he had never been able to describe, but that was, for him, associated with the garden at its best. The light that made everything look as it should look, the standard against which he measured other conditions. The specific smell of the soil here after the first autumn rain, which he knew as precisely as he knew his own name, and which he could not teach anyone else to recognize, because the knowing of it was inseparable from the long history of smelling it in this specific context. These things would not transmit. They would simply end with him, belonging to his particular experience of this particular garden, deposited in him by the garden over 43 years and retrievable by no one else, because no one else had been in exactly the position he had been in for exactly as long. This was fine. This was appropriate. Not everything needed to be passed on. Some knowledge belonged to the person who had accumulated it, was inseparable from that person's specific history, and ended with them as all specific histories ended. What continued was not the specific experience but the capacity for it, the attention, the care, the willingness to be present in a garden over a long period and to receive what the garden had to give. His successor had this capacity. The garden would give him its own knowledge, different from what it had given Kasim because he was a different person in a different time, but real, and sufficient for what the garden would require of him. The garden always found what it needed in the person who stayed long enough. Kasim had stayed long enough. His successor would stay long enough. The garden would continue. He walked back along the central path one final time, passing each plane tree in turn, pausing briefly at the second and the third to place his hand on their bark. The fourth he had already touched, had always touched last on his circuit because the fourth was the oldest and the oldest he saved for last. He placed his hand on the fourth plane tree's bark and felt its familiar roughness and its familiar coolness and the faint presence of the living thing within it, which was not a warmth exactly but a quality of there-ness, of something occupying this space that was not merely material but was also, in whatever way the word applied to a tree, alive. He took his hand away. He walked to the gate and through it and away from the garden, carrying it with him in the way he had always carried it when he left. Completely. The garden fully present in his attention even when he was not physically in it. Available to him in his quarters and in the administrative rooms, and in the corridors of the palace as continuously as it was available to him when he was walking its paths. He had been carrying the garden for 43 years. He expected to carry it for the rest of his life, however long that was. This seemed to him not a burden but a privilege, the privilege of having somewhere so fully in you that the somewhere went wherever you went. The garden was in him. He was content. He had come to understand, over the decades, that a garden had a character as distinct as a person's. Not a character that could be described in the terms used for people, not patient or generous or difficult in the way that people were, but a character in the sense of a consistent set of tendencies, a predictable response to conditions, a way of being that was specific to this piece of ground rather than to gardens in general. The Third Courtyard garden was not like other palace gardens. It was drier in summer, sheltered in a way that reduced the beneficial effects of rain, but also reduced the damaging effects of wind, prone to certain fungal conditions that damper gardens were not prone to and resistant to others. Its soil was particular, a soil that had been modified over decades by the work of many gardeners, and that had arrived, through this accumulated modification, at a character that could not have been predicted from its original composition. It responded to drought differently than the South Garden, which received more rain and retained moisture more readily. It favored certain plants over others in ways that Kasim had learned not to resist, but to work with, choosing plants that suited the garden's character rather than imposing plants that struggled against it. The roses had been his greatest negotiation with the garden's character. Roses in a dry soil required more water and more feeding than roses in richer ground, and the palace roses had been his most demanding responsibility for the entire span of his service, demanding more attention than any other element of the garden, more susceptibility to disease, and more sensitivity to the variations of each season. He had spent more hours with the roses than with anything else in the garden, had devoted more of his knowledge and more of his care to their cultivation, and had received in return, not always, not in every year, but often enough to be the nature of the relationship rather than an exception to it, a quality of bloom that he had never been able to take for granted, that had surprised him almost every year with its refusal to be merely what he had expected. The roses had always exceeded his management of them. They had always produced something he had not specifically asked for alongside what he had. This was the garden's way with the things it did best, to give not just what was cultivated but something additional, some surplus of beauty or of character that was the garden's own contribution rather than the gardener's. He would miss the roses most, more than the plain trees, which would endure regardless of who tended the garden, more than the fountain, which was a feature of the garden's infrastructure rather than a product of its living character, more than the box hedge, which he had planted, and that carried the memory of his planting, but that would continue as a hedge without specifically needing him. The roses were the part of the garden that most fully expressed the collaboration between the gardener and the garden, the part that showed most clearly what had been produced between them, that was most different from what it would have been without his specific influence. His successor would produce different roses, not worse, but different, shaped by a different relationship between a different gardener and the same garden. He had not seen his successor's roses yet. He found, examining his feelings on this, that he was genuinely curious. He hoped there would be occasions to come back and see. He made a final slow circuit of the rose beds in his mind, not physically. He had already passed through them, but in the way that a person reviews something important before sleeping, going through it one more time in the interior space where memory and imagination were not always clearly distinguished. The Damascus rose in its corner, the widow's rose along the north face, the first rose by the eastern wall. The varieties he had acquired in later years, whose names he knew better than his private names because they had come with documentation, and he had not needed to rename them, their given names being already sufficient. He moved through them all in his mind, noting their condition in the way he always noted it. Automatically, the assessment arriving without deliberation, the long habit of attention producing its results without being asked. All well. The garden was well. He had left it well. And the night was giving way at its edges, not yet light, not yet the gray of approaching dawn, but a very slight and barely perceptible change in the quality of the darkness, a thinning that was less visible than felt, the body registering the shift in the night's character before the eyes registered any change in the night's appearance. He had felt this shift thousands of times, in this garden and in the gardens before it, in all the years of early morning work that had been part of his life since his first posting. He always recognized it immediately, the body's knowledge of the approaching light being more reliable than the mind's attempt to observe it. The light was coming. The garden's night was ending. His last night in the garden was ending with it, the two things coinciding in the way that endings in a garden always coincided with the natural cycles rather than with human schedules. He walked to the gate and stood for a moment with his hand on the iron of the latch. He looked back at the garden. The plane trees in the dark, the fountain's sound, the sleeping roses. The old eastern wall with the fig trees bare arms against its stone. The lavender borders along the western path, waiting, all of it here, all of it continuing. He lifted the latch and stepped through the gate. Behind him the garden breathed its own slow breath. The plane trees stood. The fountain ran. The soil continued its invisible work. As it always had. As it always would.